Canadian GDP, as I mentioned, I had I guess, the privilege of being on CP24 last Wednesday. If any of you watching today or tuned in to CP24, you would have seen me at around 10 a.m. and commenting on the latest interest rate decision by the Bank of Canada. As we all know, there was no move. The Bank of Canada said basically in their statement that things were the same as the last meeting. Nothing really changed much. The same fears existed with respect to trade, the negotiations, the uncertainties, the unknowns. They were still present. And however, jobs numbers were okay. And they thought that things were good enough to remain on hold. And coincidentally, the Federal Reserve remained on hold as well. However, we now know who the next Federal Reserve chairman will be. And Kevin Warsh, we'll talk a bit about him later in the show. But it looks like the president has chosen a new chairman to hopefully be in the position to cut interest rates a couple of times at the very least by the end of 2026. Well, will the Bank of Canada follow suit? And I'm just not so sure they will. And the interesting thing is, when we talk about GDP and, we talk about interest rate decisions, and we're going to see in a second, we can actually pull up our first chart of GDP, and you can see it right there. One of the things I honed in on with respect to the Bank of Canada's rate decision was his comment about things were basically the same since the last meeting. Well, if you look at this chart and you see how many red bars there are in the last 10 years, you're going to notice that in the last 10 months, I should say, not 10 years, 10 months, the last 7 months out of the last 10 months are all red. Is this an economy that is firing on all cylinders? Is this an economy that is doing well? The answer to me is simply no. We're barely growing. I think the Bank of Canada says we're growing just over 1%. Is that good enough for the Bank of Canada? Is that good enough for our federal government? Is that good enough for all of us? Since when does mediocrity become acceptable? Oh, well, things are just okay. Well, that's great. Do we want it to just be okay? Why isn't the Bank of Canada continuing to cut rates to stimulate our economy? And for that matter, why isn't our federal government thinking about, talking about cutting taxes right across the board to stimulate this economy, put more money in the hands of all of us, of investors, of businesses, so that we can borrow, we can grow our businesses, we can have more money in our hands so we can go spend it in the economy, buy big ticket items, go to the malls, go to the stores and purchase things so we can better ourselves, better our lives. I just don't understand how we continue to accept mediocrity. And this chart clearly shows it. And if you go back even further, you could take in the last 13 months, what do you have? Maybe 5 out of 13 months show a positive number in GDP. We're just barely getting by. A famous economist, David Rosenberg, said recently in a CTV News interview that he thinks the Canadian economy is in a recession, that manufacturing is down, housing is down. What other indicators does the Bank of Canada need before they take an aggressive stance and continue to cut rates? David Rosenberg thinks they're going to have to cut interest rates further this year. I'm hearing by some that maybe the next interest rate movement could be higher. Maybe next year, interest rates move higher, not lower. I just don't understand, and it is quite frustrating, especially when you look at our neighbors to the south. I actually call them our competitors to the south now. Once upon a time, we shipped down to the US about 80% of what we took out of the ground and built here in our country, Canada, and the US took it in, used it, accepted it. But now we know that is not the case. We know that there are tariffs. We know that there's a negotiation going on, that Canada's probably going to have to give up a bunch of things just to be able to trade with our largest trading partner. So I look at the United States as a competitor. So if that is the case, why would business come to this country versus the United States? What advantage do we offer? What benefit do we offer? I just don't see a benefit right now. In the US, yes, their inflation rate is slightly higher, closer to 3%, but they're growing at almost 5% GDP, and they're considering cutting interest rates. They have a president who continues to do things such as cutting taxes, no tax on tips, no tax on overtime, introduces a bill to cut taxes, keep the current tax, status quo, tax rate status quo, but then do a few extra things to give people a break. What are we doing here in our country? How or why would business come here? Our premier has said $28 billion of new business came into Ontario. We heard that on our last show, Premier Ford. Imagine if we cut taxes. Imagine if we cut interest rates further. How much easier would it be for the premier to bring more business, more foreign investment to our country? I just don't understand what the Bank of Canada is looking at. And I agree with David Rosenberg. I think a 1% growth rate is unacceptable, and mediocrity is just unacceptable. Let's go to our second chart we have, which shows the Bank of Canada and our last interest rate movements. You can see January, no movement. December, no movement. We had, quarter point cuts in October, September, but prior to that, in the summer, again, no interest rate cuts. So are they going to cut this year? You know, when you look at all those red bars that we saw, that coincides with the last 10 months. So that would take us, up till, in the spring of last year. And I just think that the Bank of Canada needs to be much, much more aggressive. Our last chart for this segment talks a bit about what I mentioned is taxes, tax rates. And there you have it. I'm a big proponent of cutting taxes, not 1%. When the Prime Minister came into power, I think he cut 1% tax, off the top. And, and he used that as a selling feature. What is 1%? I don't even know how much that gets the average individual in this country, how much further ahead it gets people. I'd probably say not much at all. Look at these tax rates with our biggest, not neighbor, but our biggest competitor right now for new business. Look at marginal tax rates. If you look at these tax rates, you will see on $150,000 of income, average tax rate in our country, 43.5%. In the United States, 29%. What is that? It's a 14% difference, almost 15% difference. And if you look at the highest tax bracket in our country, you're looking at a 53% tax rate. So the CRA, the Canada makes more money off individuals at the highest rate than we actually make or individuals make for themselves. And look at the United States, 37%. And I hear out of the US that they're barking about that. They're complaining that their tax rates are too high. And here we are, 16% higher. How can we continue to be competitive? This is the question that I ask every day. The good news is a lot of people feel the same. I know TD Economics has agreed that back in the fall, they would have loved to have seen a tax cut. I've had a number of individuals on our show talking about tax cuts in the past. I will continue to push for cuts. I continue to talk to the Premier about it. He agrees that we need to see something from the federal government. And my hope, is that the Bank of Canada will consider cutting interest rates. Because right now, we can clearly see that GDP in this growth is stalling. We're obviously not in a recession, but by no means is that a reason not to continue to stimulate. In my opinion, mediocrity is not acceptable no matter where you're at. And for some reason in Canada, we seem to be okay with it. So hopefully, some point this year, we're going to get some more aggressive stimulation by the central bank. And maybe, just maybe, at one point, the Prime Minister will consider cutting taxes as well.